of the episode was explore the land. And that word,
Yeah.
explore, seems to be of fundamental importance compared with spying out the land and coming up with reports. Explore, I saw an interpretation, but I forget who gave it. It could have been the late Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, that explore as a tourist, go and enjoy, have a good look, not run the place down. Any comments?
Right. Yes. I may have mentioned it yesterday, and I think it's a mistake that not only did the spies make, but sometimes we do that as well. You know, it's true they say a guest for a while, zet a mile. When you're a guest in a place for a little while, you see beyond you see beyond. But the mistake they made was they exchanged the how they are going to conquer the land with if they can conquer the land. As General Montgomery put it, the difficult we do immediately, the impossible takes a little bit longer. And perhaps that was part of the problem of the spies, at least in some of the commentary on it, some of the Hasidic interpretation, is you're going on a mission. To quote Herzl, founding father of Israel, who said, Im tirtzu ein zu agada. Okay, or in Hasidic parlance, to translate, someone asked what Herzl said, Im tirtzu, if you desire, there's nothing that's going to get in the way, right? But there's a Hasidic expression which says, Ein lecha davar ha'omed lifnei haratzon. There's nothing that could stand before your will. When you truly desire something, when you want to achieve something, nothing will stop you, nothing will prevent you from achieving it. And I think that's an important factor that we have to keep in mind when it comes to the story of the spies, and certainly in our own lives as well. It's a similar story. We oftentimes have our struggles and challenges, no doubt about that. But we have to bear in mind that if we really want it to happen, we'll make a plan and it will be able to happen. So just to recap yesterday, we looked at some of the commentaries. We looked, first of all, at the episode within the Torah story. Sorry, I look at two screens. Just a second here. Let's admit people on the other screen. Just a second. We're going to just fix the screen up so I could see who's here and everything else that we need to see. Okay, good. So we looked at the verses. I'm not going to recap all the verses here, but this is the fiasco, the story of the spies, as you mentioned here, Benzi. And as you're all familiar with, the Torah tells us the story at the end of the parsha. We're going to get back to the spies in a moment, because today I want to focus a little bit more on the spies, but I want to go back to the lesson we were discussing yesterday about the Mekoshesh Eitzim, the person who gathered wood in violation of Shabbos, that we discussed yesterday, and he was put to death. And what we asked was, the opening question of yesterday's share was, what is the most relevant in this world? Is it intention or is it action? Right? And the reason we asked that is because the commentaries discussing this story, especially in the Talmud and the Tosafos, they ask that they mentioned that he had noble intentions. Right here you could see the words of the commentary. Where is it? Tosafos, right here. They tell us that his purpose, the idea that he had in mind, his intention was to dispel the notion that since the people were no longer destined to enter the land of Israel, as we discussed yesterday at length, due to the sin of the spies reporting negatively about Israel. So they were no longer obligated to fulfill their mitzvahs, because there were many mitzvahs that were only going to be fulfilled when they would reach Israel. So this person, in his mind, he envisaged himself that, well, I'm going to do a public, blatant desecration of Shabbos. I'm going to transgress the laws of Shabbos. I'm going to collect the wood on Shabbos, which is prohibited. And thereby, I'm going to demonstrate to everyone how it's wrong to do that, because I will be punished. And by me being punished, everyone will know that you're not supposed to violate the laws of Shabbos. And we asked three questions yesterday. Question number one we asked is, why would the people think that the mitzvah of that observing mitzvahs is specifically contingent on entering the land of Israel, being in Israel? Why would they think that? It's true that some mitzvahs were specifically relevant to the land of Israel. But why should they think that all mitzvahs are? Another question we asked is, why did he think that it was okay to commit this infraction, even if he had noble intentions? Why did he justify this behavior of his, even if it's noble? Again, going back to the difference between action versus intention. And third
Rabbi,
question we asked was, why? Yes?
To interrupt you. Between yesterday and today, I've been thinking, because we don't know who he is, could he not have been sent by Hashem as a malach, like the 3 malachim were sent to Abraham?
It's a possible hypothesis, no doubt, and I'm sure it's worth exploring. Yeah, it's certainly a possible hypothesis, but based on the simple understanding of the verse, as we say, "Ein mikra yotzeh midei pshutei," no verse, every verse is to be understood also on its simple level. So perhaps if we're looking at it on a simple level, then then we're exploring it that way. But that's very possible too. And especially if you connect it to last week's shir. If everybody remembers, last week we talked about that nothing we do in this world is not part of the divine master plan, right? So then this is all part of a plan. Whether he was an angel or an individual or a person, it's all part of a plan. But if we ask ourselves, exploring the story and trying to understand it, why does he choose specifically this mitzvah, right? He could have used any other mitzvah to demonstrate the importance of observing mitzvahs till we get to Israel. In fact, many other mitzvahs don't have such severe punishment as desecration of Shabbos. Now, when people come to me for Shabbos, and I'm glad they're in shul, because a person could be driving anywhere on Shabbos, and I'd rather that they come to shul. So I don't ask people how they got to shul or how they got to my house for the Shabbos meal. I'm glad that they came, okay? Because the idea is that hopefully people will learn and will grow and will hopefully become more and more observant in the best way possible. But at the end of the day, if we're learning the law as it is, we have to understand that Shabbos has got very important laws in Judaism, and they are of paramount importance. And the thing is that the people here thought that perhaps the mitzvahs were, as we said, contingent upon entry into the land of Israel, right? So why did they feel like that? And we went on to explain that because being outside felt like being exiled from God's presence. We gave a metaphor yesterday of a king and his wife who separated for some time, but he said to her, we are planning to get back together. And therefore, don't get used to not wearing the royal garments, because when you come back to the palace, you have to be comfortable in the royal garments as well. And therefore, perhaps you could say that God was telling the Jewish people, even though you're not in the land of Israel, and even though not all of the mitzvahs are observed outside of Israel, it seems less compulsory outside of Israel, but nevertheless, don't get used to not doing it. So we looked at the various commentaries on this. Sorry, I should have taken these out because I didn't put new texts in for today's shiur. But whatever the case is, the idea that we demonstrated is that this guy, this Mekoshesh, the collector of the wood, he went out to try to prove that when it comes to Shabbos, you could look like, even though it looks like you're committing a sin and you're not, he wanted to refute the idea that the laws are not relevant in Israel. And that's why he specifically chose the laws of Shabbos, because as we went into detail yesterday in the shir, the nature of the laws of Shabbos are quite technical. Shabbos stands out in the sense that it carries this unique clause that we mentioned yesterday called Meleches Machshavas. You can see it right here in the bottom of the text. The Rambam highlights Meleches Machshavas, the last words, that it is a deliberate action that one is guilty of, right? Only a fully intended, purposeful action is what's forbidden. So if I am digging a hole, not because I want a hole, but because I want the soil, and only digging the hole is prohibited on Shabbos, so I didn't violate the law of not digging a hole on Shabbos. So technically speaking, and as much as he didn't really need the wood, this guy, what did he need wood for? Right? Was he making a bonfire? What was the wood for? He was just doing it to prove a point, right? not to actually collect wood for a specific use. So this individual, call him the Mekoshesh, the wood collector, he didn't perform this Melaches Machshavas that Rambam mentions here, that is the deliberately violated law of Shabbos. So technically, he was not acting in violation of Shabbos, because his intention was not to violate Shabbos. His intention was to demonstrate what happens to somebody who does violate Shabbos. But what happened at the end of the day? Of course, he was still punished, right? He was still punished. And it was impossible to discern his true intention. Practically speaking, it looked like a culpable action, right? It looked like walks like a duck, talks like a duck, acts like a duck, but it's not a duck, because even though it looked like he is violating Shabbos, but he wasn't really, because his mind and his intention wasn't. So technically, he didn't really violate Shabbos. So what I want to do today is to focus on the fact that he was still punished for this. What does that tell us? Right? What does it tell us, the fact that he was still punished? There's messages and lessons that we need to learn from this, and that's what we're going to focus on today. Okay, so let's just fast forward a little bit. Here we go. So this is our question that we are left with. Why was he still punished if his intentions were actually good? And as we discussed, a physical court can only judge by a person's actions. We can't read people's minds. At the end of the day, we don't know, right? So let's go back in the story for a moment. We know why the spies thought they would be exempt from the commandments, because they thought that it's only relevant in Israel. And now they're outside of Israel, so perhaps they're not really enforceable. So how the wood gatherer proved them wrong was by him being punished for his behavior. But let's not stop there. Let's go a little bit deep. Let's probe. Let's go for a mystical explanation today and try to understand, is there a mystical, because after all, we're learning Hasidus, say this is what Chabad is about, trying to go deeper. Let's try to understand why the commandments should not be binding in the desert. What was their rationale? What were they thinking? And there is an idea that I saw in one of the Rebbe's teachings, and I'm going to put it up here. It's a little bit long. I'll read it aloud, and we'll go through it and dissect it together. He says it's explained in many places that the spies desired to remain in the desert rather than enter the land of Israel. Why? Because in the desert, where it wasn't necessary to worry about earning a living. Think about it. You come to Israel, what's going on in Israel? You can actually have to work, right? Chalutz, the pioneers, Laman Avodah, they had to work. They had to go onto the kibbutz. It's hard, difficult labor, right? But think about life in the desert. What were they doing? They were primarily occupied with the study of Torah. As our sages of blessed memory said, the Torah was given to those who ate the manna. Not so in Israel. Think about the manna. You got your food from heaven, right? You got everything you needed was provided for you. So here we're learning that cultivating a spiritual relationship with God was what they were doing, what Judaism was about in the desert. They didn't have to worry about earning a living. They didn't have to plant, they didn't have to plow, they didn't have to reap, they didn't have to grind, they didn't have to knead, they didn't have to bake, they didn't have to do any of those things. They lived in a spiritual cocoon. Think about it. Everything that was going on, all their needs were provided for. They spent their time basking in the spiritual atmosphere. They spent their time studying God's Torah, probing the spiritual. They were meditating on God's greatness. In Israel, they wouldn't have that luxury. Their primary way to relate to God would be through action. And let's read it in the Rebbe's words, what he says. Not so in Israel, where they would need to plant fields and prune vineyards for 6 out of 7 years. Remember, this year is a Shemitah year. It's a sabbatical year, right? In Israel, the primary religious pursuit would be the actionable commandments, general good deeds and the commandments unique to Israel in particular, which the Torah tells us about. So that being the case, they realized, oh, goodness gracious. Here in the desert, it's a whole different lifestyle. Think about this. In the desert, they don't have to worry about anything. They could focus on the spiritual, no physical work involved. Yeah, of course, when you come to Israel, you're still going to have to study Torah, no doubt. But you still have to earn a living. You still have to work as anywhere else in the world. It's a place of action. So there are a relationship with God, not just in Israel, but here too. Anywhere outside the desert where they receive the Torah, they're going to have to be engaged in physical, laborious work day in, day out. Not through reflection and meditation as appeared to be in the desert. And the spies, they wanted to remain in the desert because they wanted a lifestyle of this spiritual immersion, that they were just engaged in the physical, in the spiritual all day. And so now that they could stay in the desert for the next 40 years, 39 years, now we're going to live the rest of our lives in the desert. We're going to die here in the desert, even though it was a punishment, but it was exactly what they wanted. They were thrilled. In fact, Rabbi Levi Yitzchak of Berditchev, he always said, you always have to find the positive spin on even the negative stories in history. Even in our own lives, we experience some negativity. We go through a bad experience. What's the positivity? What's the silver lining in this all? Right? What's the silver lining in coronavirus? Hopefully, we got to connect better with our families and spend more quality time. Whatever it may have been, every person can answer this for themselves. So this Rabbi Levi Yitzchak said the spiritual spin on this story of the spies was that they got what they wanted. They wanted to remain spiritual. They didn't want to go into Israel, but they're going to have to work their, off, right? So we can understand this is a more mystical reason why the spies and the people of that generation thought that they were exempt from the physical commandments in the desert. We're not in Israel. Only in Israel do you have to physically work in order to connect with God. If God decreed that we have to remain in the desert, it's a sign that our purpose in life is more about deepening our spiritual relationship with God. Physical mitzvahs wouldn't be required of them because they're barred from entering the land of Israel, and they're not entering the civilized world. They're going to spend the rest of their lives as nomads. Maybe their children, they're going to have to enter the land. They're going to have to start engaging in this type of work. But we, the older generation, the one that's going to die in the desert, we're probably exempt from these physical mitzvahs. And that's perhaps another perspective on why it was that they felt that they didn't have to observe the laws the way it would have to be observed in the land. It reminds me of another thought that comes to mind. The first time I had to give my shir on Zoom, probably the first few times, maybe the first month or 2 or 3. I think by now we're much more comfortable with it, even though I do have technical glitches. I have 2 computers, which are both oldish. They're both, not the newest stuff. And somebody asked me, why can't I use Chabad funds? We raised, Baruch Hashem, decent funds, because the funds were raised for the food parcels, and I was not given permission to acquire a better or newer computer for it. So I work it out with these older computers. They have to be plugged in. If it gets unplugged, it dies, and all these little issues. But that's irrelevant. I'm just remembering the first time when we started doing these Zoom shiurim. And when I started doing my Zoom shiurim, I was very uncomfortable with my computer. I was just not sure. How do we do this? How do we get it done? It just felt a little bit, out of my comfort zone. I had to get my kids involved. Gedalia, how do I do this? And the kids were very good. They jumped straight into online school very quickly. It was very impressive how they transitioned. They pivoted very well. But for myself, it wasn't so easy to get. And I consider myself young. I'm only 18. Right? Yesterday was my birthday. 2 days ago, I turned 18 again. So, but why is it that youngsters seem to adapt to technological advances, to changes, not just technology, anything, right? You give kids rollerblades, you give kids whatever gadget or toy or whatever it is, and they're quick at getting it. And we adults, we don't seem to be so easy at it. And perhaps it's this story. Maybe the spies and those people were in their comfort zone. Maybe they were stuck in their comfort zone. And what happens is with us adults sometimes when we're in our comfort zone, I'm not used to Zoom, don't. And I still have it. There are people I call who used to come to our shiurim at Chabad. I said, come join us on Zoom. They said, no, I don't know how to use it. I said, I'll come show you. They said, no, I don't want another distraction in my life. I'm not blaming anybody. If you know people, you can encourage them. And sometimes I am like that senior citizen who's afraid to use the the technology, who's afraid to be, adjusting and adapting to the new world. Maybe that's exactly, it just dawned on me, this thought about these guys, about the generation of the desert. They were used to, they were slaves before. We already moved from slavery into the desert. Don't move us again into a new lifestyle. No, we can't handle it. And that perhaps is wrong. Don't be stuck in your comfort zone. The second last Torah, the portion of the Torah, Vayelech. Moshe turns 120 years old. He's still going. He's still moving. Vayelech. We have to keep going. We have to keep moving. We have to keep on, because that's when life ends, when we're no longer interested in growth and development and adapting. Now, of course, in a literal sense, it's not so easy. Even myself, as a young fellow, so to say, I also found it difficult sometimes, but maybe it's a lesson to me and to all of you. I guess if the hat fits, wear it. And perhaps we could say here that what was the purpose of this Makoshesh, the wood gatherer? He felt it was necessary to prove to his generation that they were wrong. It would not be enough for him to simply claim the commandments were still binding even in the desert. They would have, if he would just tell it to them, then it would just be an argument back and forth. He says, she says. I say they're still binding, you say they're not binding, we'll argue and fight. So he wanted to demonstrate to them. He wanted to show them. He wanted to prove his point, his thesis, that his point was, and he did it in this way, when you want to do something and you want to illustrate it, like Pesach, we don't just retell the story of our slavery in Egypt. We actually demonstrate. We eat the matzah, we eat the bitter herbs, we have charosas to demonstrate the mortar. We reenact it. He wanted to show the people what would be done, what's going to happen. And that's why he risked his life to be punished. Again, that's a positive spin. You might, I'm sure many others condemn him for his behavior. This is just the Hasidic way of looking at it with a positive spin. Now, we asked before why he chose specifically Shabbos, even though Shabbos has got a much more severe punishment than, say, eating non-kosher or something else. And what we explained yesterday was that it's the only commandment that he could be executed for, right? Without actually even transgressing it. Now, I want to just explore that a little bit, that he also chose Shabbos because it's the perfect vehicle through which to prove that this idea on which the spies built their argument about living a life in the desert, that it's going to be so lekker and nice to just bask in spirituality day and night, that was wrong. That we can't just live our lives spiritual. I know there are people, and unfortunately in Israel, this argument goes back and forth. The people sit and study in Kollel all day, and some say that's wrong. You can't be a hermit. You can't rely that the rest of the country is going to be in the military and earn a living, and you're just going to sit there and reap the benefits. And this is an age-old Jewish argument. But I think the idea, if he would have transgressed any other law, he would have proved to them that he was right, but it wouldn't explain to them why he was right? By him violating the laws of Shabbos, that provided a framework to demonstrate why these commandments were still binding in the desert, despite their argument why it shouldn't be relevant. Well, they remember their argument was, well, in Israel, outside of the desert, you have to physically be involved. In the desert, we're connecting to God spiritually. So spiritual connection doesn't require physical involvement. The spies wanted to stay out of Israel because they wanted to be in this spiritual cocoon. They wanted to study Torah and meditate on God's greatness. They wanted this because in Israel, they're going to have to work action. So they felt that study is the main thing. And what did he say? He said, no, my friends, you got it wrong. Let's see it in the words of the Rabbi here in this teaching. He says, the story that follows that of the spies, which is the story of the Mekoshesh Eitzim, this wood gatherer, who arose and violated the Shabbos so that he might be executed and others would take note. This story demonstrates that even sins that depend entirely on deliberate action, even these stories, sorry, not deliberate action. I read this wrong. The story demonstrated even the sins that depend entirely on deliberate intention. Remember, if you act on something, right? We have, just to clarify this, if he's digging the hole, which is an action that's a transgression of Shabbos, but he doesn't need the hole, he needs the soil. He hasn't violated Shabbos. The sages forbade it because they felt if people did behave this way, then we're going to have Ois Shabbos, right? In an ideal world, God says you're not allowed to dig a hole because that's part of the work that was related to the building of the Mishkan. If you go back to the classes we did maybe in October, where we learned the laws of Shabbos, we went through 39 laws, we discussed the laws that related to building the tabernacle and how they're specifically, so they didn't need soil for building the tabernacle, and thus requiring soil is not a violation of the laws of Shabbos. Digging the hole is. So, in this person's case, his intention was for the sake of heaven. He didn't even want to break the will of God. Nevertheless, even in this case, the defining consideration is the factual act, not the intention. His intention was noble, remember, but it's the action. And so the Rebbe says right here, the Torah of truth therefore ruled that the verdict in the earthly courts must be that it is considered a violation of Shabbos and that it is punishable by stoning as was done. So the idea I think that he's telling us here is that by him violating the laws of Shabbos, he demonstrated something that where there's a deliberate behavior that is not really a transgression, because remember what his intention was. When we said it's malachas machshavas, true violation of Shabbos is where your intention is to violate Shabbos. And yet we see that his intention was still not relevant, because he was still punished, even though a person generally is not punished when their intention was not to violate Shabbos. But God knows our intentions, right? Which means that from God's perspective, his behavior demonstrated a violation of Shabbos, his action. If the spies were correct that thoughts and ideas were the primary purpose of their desert, then his intentions should have been relevant, and he should have not been punished. Right? God should have exempted him because this took place in the desert, where according to the perspective of the spies, the intentions are more important than the actions. That's why only in Israel do you have to act on doing mitzvahs. But here it's about meditation, but a spiritual connection to God. The fact that God convicted this person, the fact that he was punished despite his noble intentions, what did that demonstrate? That even in the desert, actions were more important than ideas, even in the desert. And once this was demonstrated, then the people can no longer claim that the commandments were not binding in the desert. That, you can't say that. And perhaps that's the idea in the Rebbe's perspective that this man, the Mekoshes, was trying to demonstrate. This thought, the Jews who remain in the desert, this taught the Jews who remain in the desert, that thought it had been decreed that they not enter the land of Israel. It only meant their physical observance of the commandments would not be as potent as it would have been in the land of Israel. However, even for them in the desert, the most important aspect of the relationship with God was the manner in which it could be expressed in action to the extent possible in the desert. I think this is a very important message that he was trying to convey. That the most important and relevant thing that we could do in this world is serving God through action. As the Mishnah says, Hamaisehu ha'ikr. Because through physical action, we're able to impact the physical world around us. And so, in a world where action is primary, actions are much more important than intentions. That's why the terrorist who stabbed the Israeli in Israel, in Netanya, Beersheba, wherever it was in 2015, even though he saved his life because they discovered that the victim had a tumor, malignant tumor, You can't say he should be acquitted on charges because he saved the life of his victim. That wasn't his intention. Action speaks louder than words. So we asked the question yesterday, someone broke into your home in the middle of the night and claimed they thought you were in danger. Right? All their intention was to save you. Would you judge him for his actions or thank him for his intentions? What would you do? I have a good feeling you would think this guy's get mishiga, and to make sure he never breaks into your house again, you would call the police, make sure Cap gets the guy and he's arrested, and he's found guilty in the court of law, regardless of his noble intentions. Now, the thing is, if he was right, if you were in danger and he happened to have come and saved your life, then you would say he's a hero. But he was wrong. Despite what he thought, he broke into a house, caused damage, scared the people. In a world of action, that's the overriding consideration. Now, of course, maybe you feel not to press charges against him because he has good intentions, but that would depend on how much you believe the fella, right? Because we live in a world of action, you can only know what he did. You can't know what he thought. You have to take his word for it. And so the same is true when it comes to relationships, right? If I bring flowers to my wife, if I do the things that express love, but I don't actually love, I don't know if that's going to work, right? But here's the thing. The fact is that the marriage of a couple who treat each other kindly and lovingly, and even though they're acting real and passionate love and all the other wonderful aspects of it, it actually has a better chance of surviving than the marriage of a couple who actually love each other, but don't treat each other kindly. Yeah, because this is a world of action. What we do is what matters most. People say that it's the thought that counts, but thoughts don't save or hurt people. It's the actions that do. The road to hell is paved with good intentions. So we have to make sure that our actions are consistent with our values. We can't be content to just be good Jews in character or in our values, in our mind. You know, a student asks his professor, ethics professor, graduating college, university, who should I look out to marry? What kind of a girl? Professor says, look for someone with money. But you're an ethics professor. Shouldn't you tell me otherwise? Shouldn't you talk to me about the values and ethics and morals? The professor says, just because I teach ethics doesn't mean that I'm ethical. It's not enough to be good Jews in our heart. Then we have Jews with heart attacks everywhere, right? People say, I'm a good Jew in my heart. Then we get all these cardiac issues. The heart is not enough. It's about the action. It's about the behavior. I'm reminded of an amazing story I once read or watched a little video about, but worthwhile to share it with you. Great little story. Young lady was graduating college, and her family was very proud of her. She studied really hard. She was becoming a nurse, and she really put in all her effort and energy and time, really invested in this. And she graduated cum laude, valedictorian, you name it. And so the family was there at her graduation ceremony. They all applauded. They were very proud of her. And her father was just kvelling nachas, watching his daughter giving her graduation speech and all. As they left the graduation with her trophy and her awards and her degree in hand, they go on the way, and they decided to go to a restaurant to celebrate. And as they're walking to the restaurant, there's a homeless fellow out there in the street, and he congratulates the young lady in her cap and gown. And he says, congratulations, and he applauds her and says, and he knows her by name. And she wishes him well, and she smiles, and she thanks him profusely. So the father asks his daughter afterwards, who is this guy? A homeless fellow on the street. How does he know you? What do you got? Are you dating homeless people? What's going on here? And she says, no. And the man decides to answer. He says, unfortunately, his life is not like everyone else's. And there he is without a home. And most of the students ignore him. Some of them even taunt him and abuse him. Most people don't pay attention to him. So, but your daughter, he tells the father, she always greets me. She always smiles to him. She sometimes brings him leftover lunch or some warm clothing, whatever it is. And the father then turned to his daughter and said, my dear, before, when we were in the auditorium of the university, and I was watching this whole ceremony and the graduation and listening to your speech and all the awards and hearing the wonderful accolades that your professors were saying about you, I was very impressed. And I was proud and kvelin nachas. But let me tell you, nothing compared to this moment, hearing from this man, your care that you had for him. This makes me prouder than all your other achievements and accomplishments. What does the expression go? Nobody cares how much you know until they know how much you care. I think it's an important lesson and message. And this is what we're learning here today. It's not good enough to have all the wonderful intentions in the world. Aristotle taught all his philosophies, but when he was caught in a promiscuous act, he said, don't confuse Aristotle, the person, with Aristotle, the philosophy, the teachings and the teacher. It's two different things. But Judaism says otherwise. All the intentions and values and morals and ethics and character and culture, it's all wonderful. But the main thing is the action. As much as people tell me that they're a good Jew in their heart, that's wonderful. But action speaks louder than words and intentions. And that means that although it's important to love God, yes, and that's a feeling, it's an emotion, and to believe in God, which is certainly in our minds, but even more important is to observe God's commandments. I remember a doctor once telling me, this guy's a frum Jew, frum doctor. He's a Baal Tshuva. He wasn't always religious. He said to me, I want to tell you something, Ari. I was keeping Shabbos and kosher and Judaism for years before I became a religious Jew. He said to me that he didn't believe in God per se. He wasn't necessarily an atheist. He was more of an agnostic. He wasn't certain. He was a very academic person. But he said to me, the actions of Judaism, that's what he loved. He loved keeping Shabbos. He loved the family time. He loved all these things. And that brought him, the action brought him to actually observe and to become a really religious person inside. What's interesting is the Talmud says, when a person does something even without the proper intentions, but they'll come to the right intentions because the action, doing the right thing. I know you could say, in fact, I told the story on Shabbos at our shul. For those who haven't heard it, I'll repeat it to you here. It's a story from Simon Wiesenthal. Simon Wiesenthal mentions how he was in a concentration camp. And after the war was turned into a DP camp. My father was also in a DP camp after the war. My father was in Bergen-Belsen. I don't know which camp Simon Wiesenthal was in, but whatever the case was, there was a group of rabbis that came from America to try to bring comfort and solace to the survivors. Remember, most of these survivors lost so much of their family. They were lucky to survive. They were emaciated. They were destroyed. Everything they knew before was gone. Their homes, their family, their possessions, you name it. And they were just lucky to survive. And so the rabbis, one of the things that they tried to do, Rabbi Silver was giving out Sidurim. His name was Rabbi Eliezer Silver, an American rabbi, quite renowned personality. And he gave out Sidurim to each of the survivors. But when Simon Wiesenthal was offered a siddur, he said, no, I don't want a siddur. No, thank you. The rabbi said, oh, I'm so sorry. I can understand that everything that you experienced in the war, you wouldn't want to be praying to God after what you endured. I understand that. And he says, no, it has nothing to do with God. Don't blame this on God. This all has to do with a certain person. He described a religious Jew who managed to smuggle a siddur into his concentration camp. And this guy had a siddur in his barrack. and he hid the siddur, never took it out because they would do strip searches of the inmates. So he managed to hide it in a corner between two pieces of wood, so nobody ever saw it. But if anybody else, any other inmates, prisoners, ever wanted to borrow his siddur, he would charge them for it. Give me a piece of bread, a cigarette, whatever they had. And Salman Wiesenthal said, I was so disgusted by that behavior. I can't even look at a siddur anymore in my life. It's just despicable, that behavior. How could I look at a siddur when this is the way a man, a supposedly religious Jew, does? He charges to use a siddur. Feh. So Rabbi Silver looked at him and asked him, tell me something. Was anybody willing to pay to use the siddur? Did people give him their bread or cigarette or whatever they had to use the siddur? He said, yeah, lots of people did. So Rabbi Silver asked him, tell me something. So many people were willing to give up so much just to use a siddur to pray to God. And you're focused on the one bad guy who charged people to use a siddur? It's wrong. No doubt about that. I'm not judging somebody who was in that situation. Wrong. But is that it you can focus on? Is that it you see? Why did I mention that story? I don't remember. It was connected here somehow. The point is, we got to focus on the good. I've said this many, many times. We have to focus on the good in our own lives as well. And we have to see action as the main thing. And yes, it's important to love God and have all those feelings, but we have to do what God asks of us, right? God is effectively not a part of our lives. We don't feel God every day in our lives unless we do something. We live in a physical world. If God is not represented in our daily behavior, if we don't go out of our way to do something that God instructed us to do, God's effectively missing from our lives. We have to not just feel in our emotions, we have to do something. We have to demonstrate that feeling. We have to have action. In a world of action, having a true relationship with God means actions. That's why we do mitzvahs that are action. You light your Shabbos candles, ladies. You put on your tefillin, gentlemen. We give tzedakah. We care for the poor. We have a kosher home. We put a mezuzah on our door. These are the actions that demonstrate that we are fulfilling the will of God. Here are the words that the Talmud says, actually. Let's put it up here. Says the Gemara, Kfar Hayer Rabbi Tarfon is Kenem Asubin Ba'aliyas Beis Nitza Belud. Lud is lately in the news because of the civil war going on there between Jews and the Arab neighbors. But the Gemara tells a story that Rabbi Tarfon and the elders were once reclining in the upper story of Nitza's house in Lud, or Lida as they call it. So when this question was raised before him, which is greater? Talmud, studying, or Maisa, practice? What do you think? So Rabbi Tarfon said, great practice is greater. Maisa, the main thing is action. Rabbi Akiva says not. Rabbi Akiva had a different perspective. Remember the sages sharing their perspectives. Rabbi Akiva said, Talmud Gadol, study is greater. Why? Talmud may vilidei Maisa. Because it is study that leads to action. So Rabbi Akiva's view is that study is greater. That's actually what won the day, that everyone followed his perspective. Not because ideas are more important than actions. No, that's not what we're saying. But why is study greater? Because without study, how would you know how to behave? So what does this tell us? It's true. Study, action's important, study's important. We have to have a combination. And action is the main thing, but you have to know how to act. And that's why study is important. So no excuse not to attend the shir. I didn't tell you today, don't study. Action's the main thing, yes. Of course, it's important to love God and to make sure that we express it in everything we do. But in order for us to have action in our lives, we have to know how to act, right? And because Judaism, you could say, is a religion of deed and of creed, but of the two, deed is more important than creed, but we have to know how to perform the deed. And so if we're going to just recap the ideas that we discussed, the spy's opinion that mitzvah observance was dependent upon entry into the land, was based on their Weltanschauung, their worldview, their perspective, that prioritized, that cherished spirituality in the desert over engagement with material, physical things. That's why they didn't want to go into Israel, because they didn't want to be subjected to physical labor there. They preferred to stay in the desert where all the material needs were taken care of. Everything was tended to. They had manna from heaven. If you read the Medrash says they had free dry cleaning. They had the clouds of glory protecting them by day. They had the pillar of fire by night. Everything was engaged in the spiritual lifestyle. And so they figured that dying in the desert vindicated their idea that mitzvahs are spiritual ideas rather than concrete actions that have to be performed. And this fellow, the Makoshish Eitzim, where we discussed in today's shir, this guy proved them wrong by him committing a sin that was really only a sin in action, because his intention was just to demonstrate. His intentions were noble. But still, the reality was that even though it was technically not even a sin, because like digging a hole, it is only for the purpose of the soil, which isn't committing a sin. His intention was just to demonstrate that the importance of Shabbos, and still he was punished because his actions were sinful. And so we don't know what a person's intentions are, and that's what happened to him. He had to be punished for it. But that he was punished for behavior as opposed to his intentions, that proved to everyone that the most important thing in this world, even in the desert, is action. When you're going on a holiday, and I know in a few weeks' time everybody's going on holiday again. You're going to Kruger, you're going to the Karoo, you're going to Cape Town, you're going to Mshlag, or wherever you go in the world. When Shabbos comes, it's still Shabbos, even if you're on holiday, right? It's still Shabbos in the world. You still have to do what it takes. Action is the main thing. So the message is very clear to us, I think, that as much as it is important to have feelings for God, the most important thing we have to focus on is action, behaving as a Jew should, doing those things that we ought to. And I think that is the most important aspect and idea that we want to demonstrate today. And tomorrow, maybe we'll take it to a different angle, and we'll look at another idea, which is humility and greatness, and how we could have maybe we could do a primer on healthy self-esteem, because I think it's a good topic to discuss, and it's related to the parsha this week. So please God, that will be tomorrow's discussion. Looking forward to that. Any questions before we go? Come on, guys, don't be shy.
Rabbi, you said you had some wonderful videos to show us, a video clip. I can't remember what it was on, a couple of pashios back.
Yeah.
You said you can
see if you got to remind me.
I am.
I did show some videos. Back then, in the last few weeks, I showed some. For example, we showed you the video, Give It All You Got. If I'm recalling correctly, there was something about the Rebbe. Oh, the story of Yehuda, Avner, and the Rebbe. You know what? Let's end with that today. Give me a minute. I'm going to try to do that now. Let me just see how to do it. Okay, hold on a second. I'm going to just quickly try to find it on Google. Give me a moment here. I'm going to look for it. In the meantime, any questions? If anyone has any questions, please go ahead now. Here we go. Google found it quite quickly. Yehuda, Avner, and the Rebbe. There's a lot of searches here. Okay, there's a lot of them. I don't know which one to show. I will just go with the first one that comes up because there's a lot of them here. All right, ladies and gents, that's certainly one of the videos I promised you. So let's put that on.
Yehuda Avner served on the personal staff of 5 Israeli prime ministers. In 1977, after meeting with President Carter, Menachem Begin sent him to report to the Rebbe.
There's still segments of that meeting that are classified. I must have spoken for half an hour. I had notes, non-stop. And then the Rebbe began to comment. We were now close to midnight. And I was very tired. But the Rebbe was as sprightly and as fresh as ever. He saw I was tired. He leaned over, put his hand on mine. I wasn't sitting right in front of him. I was sitting at the side of his desk. He put his hand on mine, and he says, Rabbi Yehuda. I always remember these words. Ato makir osonu kol kach. Lama ata lo mishtoyech elenu. You know us so well, why don't you belong to us? Now I should never know whether it was only because I was tired that I had the temerity to say what I really felt, or whether I would have said it had I not been tired. But I heard myself saying to the Rebbe, Ki yesh li b'mishpachti אלה אשר רואים ברבה כוחות שהוא אינו רואה בעצמו. That I have within my own family those who see in the Rebbe powers which the Rebbe does not recognize in himself. And he got a very serious look in his eye. And he said to me these words. He said, Yesh kinire anoshim hazakukim lekobayim. There are evidently people who need crutches. I'll give straight away the English translation. He said, Rabbi Yehuda, imagine you're looking at a cupboard. And I tell you, open that cupboard. You open the cupboard. And you see inside a candle. But I tell you, that is not a candle. That is a lump of wax with a piece of string in between. Musai hashavo v'hachut nehofchim lener. When does the wax and the wick become a candle? Ka'asher ato mevi lahava el hachut. When you bring a flame to the wick. As hashava v'hachut nehofchim lener. Lemor, that is to say, they fulfill the purpose for which they were created. That is what I try to do. Shekol ish v'isha yekayim es hamatorah shelamana heim nivro. That every man and woman should fulfill the purpose for which they were created. When you bring the flame to the wick is inside, and that is the soul, then it brings to life the body, which is the wax, and the body and the soul fulfill the purpose for which they were created. And that is by the Eish HaTorah, the fire of Torah. And then, and this I can say, he began to talk to me about the Sixth Fleet in the Mediterranean. In detail. And about how it would be of strategic advantage to Israel if we could persuade Washington to establish a supply base for the 6th Fleet in Haifa. It's 2:10 in the morning. I rise. He escorts me to his door, takes me by the hand, both hands, and I say to him, Ha'im ha'Rebbe hidlik et haner sheli? Has the Rebbe lit my candle? He said, Lo. Nosati lecha es ha'gafur, rak ato yachol lahadlik es haner shelcha. I have given you the match. Only you can light your own candle.
Amazing.
Apologies, I thought you heard me. That was the video I said I would show you of Yehuda Avner, the story I mentioned a week or two ago about the Rebbe telling him about, each one of us is a candle and only you can actually light your own match. No one else could do it for you. Each person is responsible to take care of themselves. Of course, everyone else, we all could be a source of light. We could all help others out. So that was quite a profound message. Yehuda Avner was the assistant advisor and speechwriter for 5 prime ministers. And he wrote a book called The Prime Ministers about his experiences. There's a movie as well about it. I haven't yet had a chance to watch the movie, but I do have the book. Actually, somebody borrowed it from me. I never got it back yet. That's the way it goes sometimes. But what I read in the book were fascinating stories. And this is one of the stories in the book that he relates here about his, how the Rebbe told him about only you could light your own match. Ladies and gents, I hope I've done my job today of giving you some light. And hopefully you can use it, however it will inspire you for the day. Remember, action speaks louder than any words. See you tomorrow, please God. Seid gesund. All the best. Looking forward. Bring some friends on. It's Zoom. Everybody bring a friend. I'm going to make, whoever brings a friend, I will have a raffle for a beautiful book of Pirkei Avot. Where is the Pirkei Avot we're going to give away? We're going to give away a beautiful, magnificent, I don't even see it here. Okay, but whoever brings a friend, I will make sure. What we'll do is, when we reach 40 participants on Zoom, because YouTube and Facebook, I'm not sure who's watching YouTube. I can't see. On Facebook, I can see some of you, but again, I don't see. But on Zoom, when we hit 40 participants, anyone who brings an extra friend on who sticks to the shiur, tell me, send me the names, and I will put you into a raffle for a beautiful book of Ethics of Our Fathers, Pirkei Avot, beautifully colored and illustrated, so everyone can win a prize. Bring friends on, and as soon as we hit the number 40, that's the way we'll do it. As soon as we have 40 participants on the Zoom side, not Facebook or YouTube. And Facebook and YouTube, you're all welcome to participate, but if you join us on Zoom, that's where you get to participate in the raffle. I'll give everyone who's here, and everyone who's in the shiur, when we hit 40, will get to be in the raffle, and whoever brings an extra person will get extra. Winston, welcome to the shiur, Winston. Thank you for telling me you're new here, and welcome to the shiur. Nice to see somebody new on the shiur. Hope you learned. Hope you enjoyed. That you're from Jakarta, Indonesia. Wow, that's impressive. Do you mind, Winston? Can you talk for a moment? I realize we're international. I know we have participants here from Australia, Israel, and Canada, as well as South Africa. But I didn't know we have a participant from Indonesia. Are you able to open up for a moment and talk to us?
Shalom, Rabbi.
Shalom. Can we see you? Let's see your face.
I'm not setting up my camera, so next time I'll set it up.
No worries. How did you find us, Winston?
From YouTube recommendation.
Wow. Okay. It's so nice to have you on board. I hope you enjoyed the lesson, and thank you for being part of this.
Thank you,
God
Rabbi.
bless you.
Thank you, everyone.
All the best, everyone. See you tomorrow, please, God. Cheers.